This is the Podcast, your privacy and data podcast, with me, Anthony Brown, interviewing leaders from across the industry to provide you with news, views, insight and opinion. Join me for Series 3, where I'll be talking to privacy thought leaders about their stellar careers. This is Journeys Through Privacy. Hello there, I'm Anthony Brown, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to another episode of the Privacy and Data Talks podcast, aka the Padcast. So far in Series 3, I've met a variety of leading privacy professionals to discuss their careers and journeys through privacy. This week's episode will be no different, as I'm delighted to welcome Phil Lee to the podcast so we can discuss his stellar career in detail and learn about some of his experiences along the way, both the good and bad. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Phil, as he's widely regarded as one of the UK and Europe's leading privacy lawyers and has spent over 10 years as a partner in Fieldfisher's Tier 1 privacy team. More recently, however, Phil left Big Law to set up his own challenger law firm, Digiphile. Phil, thanks very much for joining us today, and a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today, Anthony.
Yes, very much so. And I've got to, I'll just sneak this anecdote now just straight away for our listeners and viewers. Phil just told me that he's hoping this session goes better than I think a live TV appearance he had a few years ago. Phil, can you just very briefly tell our listeners what happened?
Sure. It was a radio appearance, and it was while I was working in the States, but I had been asked to be part of a live radio broadcast where they were discussing the GDPR and all of its implications. And I was doing the interview by phone, so the radio station had called me at home, and I was taking the call at the top of on my mobile at the top of the stairs in our house, which was where we got the best signal. And unbeknownst to me, as I was taking the call, my son was in the bathroom, and so we just got to the point in the radio broadcast where they said, "And now we're introducing our expert for the day, Phil Lee." And at precisely that moment, my son flushed the toilet, and so all that you could hear on air was the sound of this flushing toilet. Which wasn't my proudest professional moment, but kids.
Kids. What can go wrong when they're around, hey? But no, I love that one. Hopefully, we'll get away with it today. Although you have pre-warned me that you do have dogs, and in approximately 25 minutes. We may hear them, but anyway, we'll persevere. So I'm showing my age a bit here, Phil, and maybe giving yours away a little bit as well. But we actually, when I was thinking about this the other day, ahead of our recording, I realised that we've actually known each other since 2005. And I think at that time, I actually approached you about a role at Google when they'd not long landed in London. And I was doing some work with them to sort of, help set up their legal team in London. So, I mean, the days when Google had just landed, it's quite crazy to think that day ever existed, I suppose. But anyway, here we are nearly 20 years later, and you founded your own specialist law firm, Digiphile. So, I mean, suffice to say, it's been a pretty successful couple of decades. I know our listeners are going to be intrigued to hear about Digiphile, Phil, and we're absolutely going to come on to this. But if you don't mind, can we just take you back a few years to when you were a trainee? You were at Denton WildSat, now more commonly known as Denton's. Well, firstly, what made you choose a career in law?
Oh, it's a very winding story, I think. But I'll try and give you the reasonably condensed version. I was studying computer science at university, and I was enjoying computing a lot, but I sort of quickly realized about a year or so into my degree that I didn't really want to spend the rest of my life programming. So I love technology, but I didn't love programming. And I sort of at the end of my second year, I actually did a summer camp working in the States, and it was my first time traveling there. But I worked on a summer camp just outside Washington, DC. And I was teaching kids programming. And so it was a combined technology and sports camp. And it was a day camp. And so I was living with an American family, and both parents in the family were lawyers. And they used to drive me to and from the camp every morning. And in the journeys in, as I was having all these doubts about, kind of what I wanted to do for a living, the father who would take me to and from the camp was telling me about the antitrust cases that he was working on. And one of them I remember because it was to do with price fixing in the double glazing market. And he used to explain this case to me. I just found myself sort of, really riveted by the details he was giving. And I think I had this sort of moment of realization that if I could find price fixing and double glazing, which are arguably two of the most boring possible topics you could cover, interesting, then maybe law was the right career for me. So I finished up my time at the camp. I came back to university and then spent a lot of my third year trying to apply for various training contracts with different law firms, getting rejected by everybody I approached, with the exception of Wild Sapt as it was then. And so I got invited for an interview, was accepted onto a training contract, and that was sort of how it all began.
Amazing, amazing. So very early on, you were inspired by people that you'd crossed paths with. Are you still in contact with those people, by the way?
Yeah, I am. It's amazing. I mean, the two lawyers are now retired, but when I was there, they had young children. Their young children are now sort of late 20s, early 30s. They've gotten married. It was a long time ago, but no, we've kept up that contact because for me it was a real sort of sliding doors moment. I think it was one of the few points in my life I can really point to where I can say I went down a completely different path from the one that I'd anticipated for myself up until that point.
Brilliant. I'm sure they're extremely proud to have been part of your journey and to see what's happened since. So fair play to Wild Saps, now Denton's, for seeing the potential in you. So what was your very early sort of legal career looking like when you were training and then sort of early qualification? Was it was there any element in those days of data protection privacy, albeit it was a very different time in that sort of stratosphere, or what were you sort of involved in?
So originally, I worked in Denton. It became Denton Wild Sap very quickly, just before or after I joined them, and they had the leading TMT practice in the country at the time. So it was quite an exciting team to be part of. And there was a lot of trainees, and I qualified actually into the telecoms regulation team. At the time, it was a Communication Act that was all the big thing. And I'd only been sort of qualified for a few weeks, and then DLA did a big recruitment swoop on Denton's and hired about 2/3 of the department. And of all the trainees that qualified, I think there were 7 that had qualified into the department. I was the only one that remained. And I would love to tell you it was a great act of loyalty on my part. It actually wasn't. I was never asked to join DLA, so that was the reason. I'm not sure how the other 6 got the invite and I didn't, but I probably should take offence to that. But anyway, so I stayed behind, and honestly, at the time, it felt like a tragedy. But sort of with reflection, it was probably the greatest thing that ever happened to me career-wise, because I moved. I had to pick up a very broad variety of work. I went from being just a very specialist telecoms regulatory lawyer to having to pick up everything, which included sort of IP, tech transactions, and of course data privacy. And it just so happened that I ended up sharing a room with Nick Graham, who is a titan amongst data privacy professionals,
and the
and
originals.
Yeah, one of the originals. Very understated lawyer, but quite brilliant. And and so I picked up bits and pieces from him. And yeah, absolutely. Back then, data privacy was was really a very small part of our workload. It was maybe 10% of what I did, and it was one of those areas that was a bit like sort of tax that people had a bit of an allergic reaction to. They tried to keep as far away from as possible. It was seen as very confusing, very difficult, and I never felt that way about it. I think partly because I got the background in technology anyway, and actually my dad was a database programmer, so I'd always been brought up around data and databases, and so a lot of what was being discussed was just things that felt very natural and obvious to me. And if I'm brutally honest as well, it appealed to me as an area of law because I would see people doing corporate transactions or litigation, and they'd be working round the clock, stupendous hours. And data privacy, at least back then, wasn't like that. So I thought, here's an area of law I understand. The work-life balance isn't that bad. I can keep this up. I really have no idea what was in store for me a decade later. But yeah, that was how it sort of began.
Fantastic. So in this, the current environment, where there's, AI involved, and obviously it's been, privacy's moved on so much. Do you remember the sort of matters you might have been dealing with back then?
Well, a lot of it, at the time, Denton's had a very big public sector outsourcing practice, and so a lot of my work was on these sort of big public sector deals where I would, be working on, maybe sort of the IP and data privacy clauses of contracts, or we'd have the occasional kind of technology startup that would come to us, and they would, it was mostly privacy notices. They would come to us and say, "We want a privacy notice," and the kind of conversation you would have with the client back then would be to say things like, "Well, okay, what data are you collecting? What are you using it for?" And the response was very much, "Look, I don't care about any of that. I just want a notice. Just draft me something. We'll stick it on our website." And so, you very often ended up drafting the same kinds of notices over and over and over and over and over again, with very little tailoring for clients. And you would send them out with sort of due warnings to the clients that they need to reflect that need to check that it reflects what they're actually doing, tailor as necessary. But half the time they didn't, and it would just go up on the website. I actually have one recollection of a Premier League football club. This wasn't specifically data privacy, but I drafted some terms for where I'd left drafting notes in the document, like square brackets highlighted, tell questions for them. And they obviously never read the thing because they put it straight up on their website with all the questions and highlighting intact. But I think that was a lot of the attitude back then. And I suppose it's both, it is pleasing to see that we've moved on a lot from then. And actually, now when I do privacy notices for clients, they tend to pore over the detail over them. The language is reviewed very carefully. There's a lot of careful examination about whether it's actually accurately describing the data that's being used, how the data is being processed, whether it's covered off all the data subject rights. So it's a world apart now from what it was back then. But early days were very simple instructions.
Yeah. And I mean, it's when you describe it in such a way. I mean, it's quite amazing that you kind of decided that you'd found your space and you wanted to continue with it. And as it was fairly basic work in hindsight, of course, I'm sure it didn't feel like it at the time. In many
Well,
ways.
yeah, and one of the things that really appealed to me when I sort of got into it, aside from the fact that it sort of just felt a bit more natural than other areas of law, was I'd sort of I'd maybe watched Erin Brockovich or something and decided that what I wanted to do was some area of law where I could bring some kind of benefit to the world, but also I'm a bit of a domestic animal. I do like my creature comforts, and so working in data privacy was a nice area where it felt you could be working in a human rights space, but actually, still earn a decent living. And so it kind of ticked two boxes really in that way. So that appealed to me as well. And actually, I was just going to say one of the great example of the early days as well that I do remember was drafting my first ever marketing consent for a client as well, where we did a technology client that's no longer in existence, but we drafted this sort of this opt-out box of the website. And I was a very junior lawyer at the time. I was very crafted the language very carefully. If you no longer wish to receive marketing communications from us, you can opt out by ticking here. And the client went ahead and implemented it. And I remember feeling this enormous sense of pride of actually going to their website and seeing my language up on their website. And then about 2 weeks later, we got a really angry complaint from a data subject who said that they were still receiving marketing despite having opted out. And we spoke to the client and we said, well, we don't understand it. We gave you this language, and what's going on. Anyway, when they investigated with it, what they discovered was they put the language up on the website, but they basically hadn't hooked it up to any marketing system. So people were happily checking the box to opt out, and it was entirely being ignored. That instruction was going nowhere. But again, it's a very good I suppose, indication of what it was like in the early days. The thinking was very much, as long as we've got the language, we've ticked the compliance box. It's very different to now, where there's a lot more emphasis put into investigation and implementation.
Indeed, indeed. And you see, obviously working with Nick Graham, and you stuck around for quite a bit longer at Denton's, and then you moved on to Osborne Clark. And we discussed the other day. I think you you were involved quite a lot in video games around that sort of time. So you spent a good sort of 3 or so years at Osborne Clarke. So did that sort of thread of privacy continue when you moved on there, or?
It did. I think actually it was probably really the making of me as a privacy lawyer in some ways, because when I had worked at Denton's, you always had this kind of big comfort blanket that, whatever advice you did would get checked by Nick, and you knew if you made a mistake that Nick would be there to correct it for you. Whereas when I went to Osborne Clarke, there was less of that comfort blanket, and so there was also a lot of responsibility delegated to lawyers at a mid-level of their career, more so than Denton's did. And so I think in my sort of first week there, we had a meeting with a big video games client, and my boss at the time said, "Oh, they want to speak about data privacy," and I was like, "Okay, great. We're going down to the meeting together." And he said, "No, you're going to do it on your own." And I remember walking to that meeting sort of absolutely terrified, realizing it was the first time I was going to kind of fly completely solo and take instructions and give advice without somebody looking over my shoulder and making sure that I stayed on course. And it's terrifying, but when you are put on the spot like that, you make sure you know your stuff that much more carefully than when you've got somebody sort of constantly checking what you do. Mm. And so I moved to Osborne Clarke because I was interested in working in the video game space, and a lot of games clients obviously collecting lots of amounts of player data, but I was also doing more traditional licensing kinds of things as well. But over time, the games industry, the publishers has got bigger. They bought up all the developers, and they developed these very large in-house legal teams that did all the routine licensing stuff that I was doing. But the things that they couldn't do was the specialist regulatory pieces. So data privacy just kept coming out as an area of work. And so I went from sort of being, I suppose, a video games lawyer who did a bit of data protection to becoming a data protection specialist for video games companies, to just becoming a data protection specialist for all and everyone.
Mm. Excellent. So I guess there's a lesson there for people listening who perhaps at the beginning of their journeys, that actually, you mustn't kind of underestimate going to perhaps a smaller or boutique firm. People can get obsessed with the bright lights of some of the larger firms, but actually you're going to get greater exposure much more quickly in your career if you land somewhere of the ilk as you did at that time of Osborne Clarke. So I must point out that it's not specifically Osborne Clarke. There's lots of law firms out there that I'm sure do exactly the same. So for anyone listening, but okay, cool. So you had a really good, I think another 3 or 4 years there, and then. Wow. I mean, in hindsight, this must have been a big, a huge turning point for you in your career, or a big move. You actually moved to Fieldfisher, which at the time, correct me if I'm wrong, but had, I think, Europe's largest dedicated privacy practice. And you were then working with Eduardo Oosteran and Stuart Room, of course, who are two further heavyweights in this space. Could you just describe those sort of days? It must have been amazing energy around that time, working with Stuart and Eduardo, I guess there's some mentoring going on there as well for you.
Yeah, I think energy is probably the right word whenever you're talking about Eduardo. I mean, I was always very drawn to the Fieldfisher practice because what I found was, when I was working at OC, I would try to get out press releases and things about new things that were happening in data privacy, and invariably, no matter how quickly I turned it around, Fieldfisher always got there before me, and so I would, where I was working at OC, I was a privacy specialist, but I wasn't working in a dedicated privacy team, and why Fieldfisher was so exciting was this opportunity to work with a team that did nothing but data privacy, and to have peers that could challenge my thinking on things, because I sort of realized I'd gotten to a point where I thought I knew quite a lot, but I realized I didn't know everything. And there were times where I wasn't always certain about the advice I was giving, and having people I could turn to say, yes, Phil, we agree with you, or no, Phil, you've got that horribly wrong, and this is why. I realized I still had that aspect of learning that I needed to do. And of course, Eduardo was a legend, Stuart as well. And Eduardo had approached me after a conference and invited me to join and the team was fabulous. It was everything I hoped it would be. Tremendous peers from the very sort of junior levels up to the very senior levels, all really knowledgeable and really well informed about privacy, and very committed to it as a cause. And all the credit to that really goes to Eduardo and Stuart, because they built up this amazing team. I'd like to think that they got this amazing capacity for identifying skilled people. Not trying to blow my own trumpet there, but it's just the people I was working with. And they were two very different characters as well, because Eduardo comes with this enormous enthusiasm, an enormous level of energy. It's kind of it's hard not to kind of feel that kind of rub off on you when you just kind of spend time with him. And Stuart also comes with this sort of very barristerial authority to everything he approaches. And so sort of learning from both of them, I just got very different experiences from each. Stuart as well, with him, he's got this enormous ability to multitask like no one I've ever seen. He could take a phone call, give advice, be browsing the internet and texting people all at the same time, and do all of them extremely competently in a way that I've not really seen anybody else be able to manage. Certainly I can't. And it was a great experience, and both of them really sort of instilled a sense of sort of academic discipline about the law, making sure that you really knew what you were talking about, and a sense of not just kind of trying to help your clients work around the rules, but also trying to drive your clients towards what was the right solution. And that was a really sort of positive experience for me. So I owe both of them a great deal, along with Nick, in terms of my overall development as a privacy lawyer.
Yeah. And I mean, again, in hindsight, I mean, could you have asked for three better people perhaps to have worked with and learnt from? So perhaps it was written in the stars for you, Phil, that you would go on this journey.
Well, I also need to give a shout out to Mark Watts at Bristow's as well, because I sort of encountered Mark a couple of times over the years, and had at one point very closely looked at joining Bristow's, and then for various reasons it didn't happen. But Mark had always, from afar, been a supporter of my career as well, and had helped me get into a couple of sort of technology groups when really he had no obligation to, and I was working for a competitor law firm and everything. But I always found him a great source of support as well. So I think I was quite lucky, actually, as a junior lawyer. I had some very well established senior lawyers in the area who just sort of helped me along the way.
You land at Fieldfisher, and I think within 2 years you're made up as partner. So you're relatively young at this age. I mean, you still are, Phil, of course, but you know what I mean. So how did that all come about? And was it a big? Did you notice a big step up to become a partner?
Yes, I did. Actually, I remember Eduardo saying to me before I got made up, he said, "If you think you're busy now, you're about to become busier than you could ever possibly imagine." And that was very true. It's a curious process going through partnership. It's a thing that I think all lawyers aspire to when they're in private practice, partly because it's what you're told you should aspire to. But honestly, I had no idea really what it entailed, other than it meant I got a bit more senior and got paid a bit more. I didn't really fully understand the entirety of what the role would be. So it was like a next step along the career progression path that I was supposed to aim for, but without fully understanding the consequences of it. And it's quite a strange thing, because back then, I remember when I got promoted with a couple of other people into the partnership. And then the day after I got promoted, the firm gave us a talk on what it means to be a partner. And I remember thinking that's just the wrong way round. It should have been, first you have the talk, what does it mean to be a partner? Then you decide whether it's the right thing for you, and and then you go forward if that's what you're intending to do. So it was quite a strange experience in that sense. And I know towards the end of my time at Fieldfisher, there was a lot more, I suppose, sort of mentoring and development that went into kind of getting people ready for partnership, and a lot more discussion around sort of understanding what the business case is and what the financials were that were expected of them, and the kind of their responsibilities in terms of being a manager and business development and upholding the values of the firm and all that kind of stuff. But I think at the time I was promoted, a lot of that stuff that infrastructure wasn't kind of in place in the way that it is now. So when I did get in, I think a lot of sort of lawyers, when they first qualify, have this kind of odd experience where you go from being a trainee where nobody trusts your advice and everything gets very checked very thoroughly, to overnight you become qualified, and suddenly people start asking your opinion and taking you very seriously. And it's a very abrupt shift, and it's quite unsettling, I think, for a lot of newly qualified solicitors, because suddenly you feel that you're given this credibility that you maybe don't feel you've earned yet. And it's a similar thing when you become a partner, because you go from sort of giving advice under the auspices of the partner that you're working for, to suddenly being that partner that is responsible for maintaining client relationships and building new relationships and going out and developing business, and then also making sure that you feed the team. You are. I was always very conscious of the fact that the income I generated was responsible for keeping people busy and paying their salaries, and justifying new hires to the team and all of that kind of thing. So yeah, I'll be honest and say I didn't fully appreciate all of that. I think really I just saw, at the time, I just thought of myself as being a moderately successful lawyer who was getting progressed along the path without fully understanding the consequences. But it was but once I was promoted and actually did get my head around it properly, I mean, the role of being a partner was just fantastic. I loved it, because I think you reach a point in your career where you've done a lot of the routine legal advice, and so the issue becomes, what's the next challenge for me? And actually building a team and building a client base and generating revenue, that does become the challenge, and it's hugely rewarding.
Did you find business development, kind of natural? I know some partners find it easier than others, being able to self-market and speak at this, that, and the other. How did you find all of that?
Um, I I think once I found my preferred way of doing it, it came relatively naturally. But I think different people have different approaches to this, and a lot of partners that reach that level and that are really good at business development tend to be natural extroverts. They kind of thrive in the company of other people and holding a room, and that really wasn't me. I think by nature I'm probably more of an introvert, and so I used to kind of go to these sessions as a younger lawyer, where they would say, oh, once you walk into a room, introduce yourself to a whole group of people, use their names several times in conversation. I'm hopeless at remembering names as well, so that was a bit of a non-starter for me. So, and that kind of stuff, to me, I just found slightly excruciating. But where I did find my sort of way forward in kind of terms of doing it was, I made a lot of use of social media. Sort of Twitter, LinkedIn, things like that were just really starting to become quite popular at that point, and I found they were enormous platforms for me to really just download my thoughts on a topic and find that other people responded to it, and then would sort of ping me questions about it, or ask to meet me and discuss some of the things I was saying. And the kind of the speaking side of it, talking at conferences, I found was great as well, because actually, if you give a presentation, it can be pretty nerve-wracking, particularly when you're sort of new to the experience. But at the end of it, people would come up to you and they would introduce themselves to you, rather than you having to kind of break into conversation slightly awkwardly. And so I found that was a great way of sort of developing relationships and getting to know people as well. So I would say I'm not a natural kind of work the room kind of guy, but I just had to find different avenues for doing it, and those avenues worked very well for me.
Excellent. And then a few months as a partner in London, and then the firm asks you to go over to the US, to Palo Alto, and become a head of Fieldfisher's US office. So crazy few years for you. How did that all come about with the US piece?
I have Eduardo to thank for that as well, but the honest answer to it is that we'd done a business trip over in San Francisco. We were returning to the airport on the train, and as we were on the train, I was looking out the window, and I think I just muttered under my breath, God, I'd love to live out here. And Eduardo sort of turned around very sharply and said, "Would you really?" I said, "Yeah, in a heartbeat," without really thinking about it. I thought it was just one of those conversations. And what I didn't know at the time was that the firm had been thinking about opening a Silicon Valley office, and they were trying to find the right person to do it. And I think I was quite lucky in that I was sort of young enough that I hadn't got kids embedded in school, and so it was, it was difficult to move. And I had the technology background, which obviously being in Silicon Valley, is a major plus. And and I was going through the partnership promotion path, so I was kind of ticking the box in terms of being a partner rather than a senior associate. So entirely unbeknownst to me, I think Eduardo had a few conversations, back in the office, and then it's sort of a month or two later, it was kind of almost presented to me like it was a fait accompli. Hey, good news, you're going out to San Francisco, and I was, oh, sorry. And so I then had to go home and explain that to my wife, who I think was sort of less enamored at the time, having young twins, that we were suddenly going to be moving away. But after a bit of pleading, she was very supportive of the whole thing, and we moved out. And yeah, it was a tremendous experience. But it was like starting as a partner all over again, because I suddenly landed on the other side of the Atlantic, had very few people that I knew, and sort of had to kind of work the circuit again in terms of getting to know people, establish my reputation, establish the firm's reputation. And I think my real defining moment of success was that when we first landed, everybody referred to me as Phil Lee from Freshfields, and I had to say, no, 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 we're not Freshfields, we're Fieldfisher. And after about a year, people did actually start to refer to us as Fieldfisher, and I realized at that point, that was when the name recognition had landed.
Amazing. God, that must have been a very, very exciting period for you. And
I think it's terrifying.
yeah. So you were literally first on the ground there, were you, with a remit to sort of build the office out? So you're responsible for hiring and just essentially running the entire office. I guess really, and obviously we're going to come on to Digiphile very shortly, but perhaps again in hindsight, that's kind of stood you in some good stead, in relation to setting up your own law firm.
Yeah.
But we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that, Phil. So really successful time in the US. You then came back to the UK. We're talking here, I think 2016-ish. So I think around that time, GDPR had been finalised, and there was the 2-year runway for everything to come into play. So, pretty smart timing again, I would say. From a career perspective, to come back and obviously be super busy. So, but I know. Around those sort of times, or that sort of time. In fact, you spent another couple of years pretty much at Fieldfisher, but I know that both in your personal life and professional life, you've been starting to have discussions with yourself about what was next and what was right for you and your family. And so, firstly, you made a huge decision to relocate with your family. To the rolling hills of North Yorkshire and actually leave London, but you actually continued to work at Fieldfisher. So what happened? And I guess this is prior to the pandemic as well. So you were ahead of the curve of moving out of London.
Yes. I mean, the short answer is I'd always had a long heart ambition to move to North Yorkshire. When I was young, my parents used to come up here on holiday a lot, and I just grew up loving the area, really. So I'd always wanted to do it, but I thought it would be one of those things that would be like a sort of retirement option for me. I didn't actually really think it would be possible to kind of work as a busy city lawyer and do so from North Yorkshire. I mean, really what it was, I think, I mentioned we moved out to the States when my kids were really tiny. And at the time, while we were in London, I was spending a lot of my time commuting in and out. And I felt that I was missing a lot of time with the kids when they were, in the mornings and the evenings, because, I tended to work late and then had to commute onto that. I got back, when they were all tucked up. And then when we moved to Silicon Valley, I was living 10 minutes away from the office. And so my long sort of almost 3-hour commute every day dropped down to about 20 minutes. And I suddenly had all this extra time with the children. And when we moved back to the UK, I realized I just really didn't want to give that up. I was, as difficult as it would have been, I was prepared to walk away from city life if it meant I had more time with my wife and kids. And so, I was thinking hard about it. My wife actually just said to me, well, why don't you ask Fieldfisher if you can work remotely? And I honestly, it hadn't really even occurred to me as an option. I was just so convinced they would say no. But she persuaded me to ask. And so I had a conversation with the firm's managing partner, Michael Chiswick, who, without batting an eyelid, said yes. And, he he sort of warned me that I might lose some clients if I wasn't in London, and I said, okay, I'm all right with that. But actually, as it kind of turned out, because I had such a strong US client base, and being back in the UK for US clients, they really didn't really mind whether I was in London or North Yorkshire or wherever, as long as I was on the end of Zoom or Google Meet or whatever they needed to talk to me over. And so it actually had no impact on my client base whatsoever. My clients only continued to grow over the coming years, and I found I could work very effectively from home. The difficulty, of course, is you've got a responsibility in terms of team management. So I had to make sure that I travelled down to London regularly, but that was manageable. I did that sort of every couple of weeks, and I was lucky that I had a great team of partners. Hazel, Renzo, Leone, and at the time Judy Krieg in London, who played a huge role in terms of managing the team. So I was kind of left to focus really on building clients and generating work, and it just worked extremely well. But it did mean still work very long days, but not having the commute meant I did get to see my kids at the beginning and end of the day, and for my and their emotional well-being, that was hugely important.
And as I alluded to as well, I mean, just it's a couple of years prior to it's all been restricted to being at home, working at home, working over Zoom, Teams, whatever it might be, and you're already sort of in the flow of that, I guess,
Yeah, yeah.
given the circumstances. So, and then I guess that arrangement continued, for a good period of time, but then you made another enormous decision career-wise, which is you actually decided to move on from Fieldfisher, probably at a time, I guess, when your stock couldn't have been any higher, in terms of being so well respected, regarded within the community as a privacy leader. So what happened there, Phil? What was the thought process around that time?
Uh, it was a couple of things, I think, really. I think a lot of the people that I had worked very successfully with in the team at Fieldfisher had moved on, and they'd all taken great roles in big tech companies, and so there was sort of new blood coming into the team, and so I felt maybe there was a bit of a changing of the guard that way, and that was perhaps a sign for me. But also, I think sort of bit longer term, I'd always sort of harbored that thought about, could I establish my own practice? Could I run my own business? Maybe sort of given the bug a little bit by having run the US office in Silicon Valley and realizing all the things I got wrong there and could maybe do better second time around. And so it was kind of one of those nagging thoughts where I just thought, if I don't try and do it now, I'm probably never going to do it. And so so I decided to take a break, and for a period of time just reflect on what it was I wanted to do next, and just take some time out, because I'd been working hard for 20 odd years, and honestly I was exhausted as much as anything, so I just needed a bit of a rest. But then during that time, I kept returning to the thoughts about establishing my own practice, and then was slightly terrified about doing so, because it felt like a very grown up thing to do, to set up your own company, and the kind of thing that other people do, not that you do yourself. But I decided in the end, after speaking to some others who'd done the same, that I would give it a shot and see where it took me, and so that was how Digiphile was born.
Excellent. I was actually thinking about the name Digiphile, and realised that it's got your name in it, Phil. So was that one
Honest to
of the ways
goodness,
you like?
it was like trying to choose the name of your university rock band. We agonized for weeks over the name. I had my wife, my kids, we were all going through various iterations, and to me, and you know, people often build their own practice based around their own name, which I can entirely respect. Often the brand value is in the individual.
Yeah.
Um, for me, I just thought I'd just feel too embarrassed doing that. It felt a little bit too much like sort of hubris on my part. So I wanted to have a name that wasn't just Phil Lee, Legal Services or something like that, but at the same time, had a bit of me in it. And so we landed on Digiphile. We thought it was a good name because, as anybody who's worked with me will tell you, I just have an absolute love of all new technologies, and so it kind of represented both that, but also got the Phil in there.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and also I've noted your extremely modern job title, which is a hybrid between a managing director and a zettabyte lawyer. So it's truly refreshing. How have you found it anyway, Phil? I mean, you've been sort of trading for just under a year, is it now, or so? How's it all been?
Yeah, that's right. Well, firstly, on the zettabyte lawyer thing, I mean, the other driving motivation for me in setting up Digiphile was just to try and do a few things slightly different. There are there are ways of working in the city that I wanted to kind of revisit in terms of running my own practice, and so that was things like offering greater flexible working, having more of a charitable arm to kind of some of the stuff that we do, um, and to kind of making sure that we have lawyers who are at the top of their game, but also we don't work them into the ground, which is a worry I have about the way that a lot of big city practices are going nowadays, with the ever greater emphasis on hours and rates and fees and so on. So I wanted to do something that would enable people to develop their careers and become sort of more rounded out lawyers without sort of killing them in the process of doing so. The In terms of how it's gone, I mean, it's just been tremendous, really. I think I hadn't really, I just wasn't sure, who would follow me. I mean, the biggest mistakes I've ever seen lawyers make in their career has been when they think that they're the whole, that they are the be all and end all of their practice. And I've seen partners get hired who promise to bring in a huge amount of money and then fail to do so because they don't realize actually the attraction was never really them; it was the firm that they were at. And Fieldfisher obviously is an absolutely stellar firm, and so my concern was when I set up Digiphile that maybe I would just have a small trickle of clients and that would be it. But actually, from the word go, we were just inundated with demand, and originally I thought it would just be me. I'd see how I could carry on my own, with my wife providing some back office support. Very quickly realized that I was just turning away a lot of clients and a lot of good work, and a lot of the people I was having to turn away were people I've known for a very long time, and just on a personal level, it felt like I was letting down friends, and on a business level, it felt kind of stupid to keep turning away money. So the end, I decided that we would recruit and build the team up a little bit, and so we're now at 5 people, and there's 3 of us are lawyers, 2 on the operations kind of support side. And the practice continues to be very, very busy. We're continuing to get new inquiries, new clients all the time. I my sort of my original thinking was, maybe I'd have a roster of about 10 clients who send me kind of repeat work, and that would keep me busy. We're currently at about 50 clients, and I'm hoping we're going to continue to grow that. And so it's all going very well.
Amazing. So the snowball has begun, and I guess it's there's no way of stopping it probably now, I'd imagine, to a certain degree, in the nicest possible way. So you do see that Digiphile will continue to grow, and you're on that path now.
Yeah, I am. I've got no ambitions to become the next mega firm, but I think certainly as a as a good sized, mid-sized niche practice, our focus is always going to be on sort of data protection and cyber and AI and maybe digital regulation. We're not going to we have no aspirations to become a full service firm doing absolutely everything. I want to kind of keep that focus, and while I sort of hope to grow the team a bit more so that we get more good specialists doing the kind of work that we like to do, I also kind of want to keep it at a level where everybody knows everyone, and we can be personal. So we will grow, but we're not going to become huge, I think is the best answer. Mind you,
Yeah.
having said that, I'll also tell you that the one thing I've learned over the past year is that everything I thought was going to happen ended up changing. So you never know. Maybe I'll revisit these thoughts in a couple of years' time. But for now, that's the thinking.
I feel another podcast episode coming on with you, Phil, in about 3 years, when you're in your mega high rise in the city. And in fact, it amazes me, because obviously part of my job, I speak to so many people, of your ilk and your caliber, and it never sort of ceases to amaze me how regularly people kind of allude to the fact that they suffer with a bit of imposter syndrome at times, and it amazed me as much as anyone when we spoke a few weeks ago that you'd felt that when you first started, you had some imposter syndrome, and I think anyone who knows you, Phil, and has worked with you, or followed your career would think that's just ludicrous, knowing what you've achieved. But I guess to some degree, we all, experience that, in our lives. But what brought that on for you? Do you think? What's
Oh, you know, I think I'm always very, very conscious of what it is I don't know. And, I think particularly in this sort of age where in the privacy space, there are so many talented professionals out there now. I talking earlier about sort of what it was like 20 years ago. There was a handful of us, and it was easy to be recognized in a very small space. Now it's an enormous space. I actually remember the IPP coming to visit, Trevor coming to visit us, well, I think it was back in around 2007 when I was at OC, and so he was kind of proudly telling us at the time, I think the IPP had about 7,000 members. Now it's I don't know, 80,000 members plus. Just gives you an idea of the growth of the profession. So I'm always very aware of the fact that there are a lot more people out there now doing what I do. I read a lot of the stuff that they publish, and some of it is remarkably erudite and well thought out, and you sometimes you read things and you think to yourself, gosh, I wish I'd thought of that, or I really wish I'd been able to write that, or that had been something I'd been aware of. And so starting up your own practice, or even just being a partner in a big practice, you're always very conscious of the fact that there are other people who maybe do what you do. In fact, not maybe, almost certainly do what you do better than you do it. But I suppose it's also that kind of pressure that also drives you to keep on improving yourself. So imposter syndrome is, it definitely is something that you worry about. You worry there are people that are more deserving than you to sort of have some of the success you've had. But at the same time, I suppose it's that anxiety that keeps you working hard and trying to achieve.
Exactly. Never rest on your laurels. No, it's fascinating to think about that and hear about that, Phil. And there doesn't seem to be a dull moment, as we know, in the world of privacy. There hasn't been for many, many years. But what do you see right now, present day, as the single biggest challenge for businesses in relation to privacy?
I'm sure everybody's going to say this, but I think it has to be AI, doesn't it? I mean, it's funny, actually. One of the things I'm doing later today is giving a presentation to client around AI for data protection professionals. And when I deliver it, I'm going to be talking through sort of how the technology actually works, and what things like neural nets are, but then going into kind of how privacy regulation applies, bits about the AI Act, but the really interesting thing about it is that there is always like a perfect storm of events. On the one hand, you've got this remarkably sophisticated technology that's very, very hard for most people to understand, and actually even for the engineers, often they know how to build it, but they don't know how it achieves the things that it achieves always. On the other hand, you've got this wealth of regulation emerging, both in terms of applying existing regulation, but also you've got all these governments piling in and producing sort of non-binding frameworks and proposing new laws and what have you. And for a privacy law, that's just an overwhelming amount of information to take in. And then you've got the fact that the use of AI can be so varied, it's so dependent on context. And so trying to say, well, this is the solution that will work across everything just isn't something that exists. You always have to look at, okay, what are we doing here? What's the purpose? What's the data? Who's going to be using it? Where is it going to be launched? All of these different things. So it's a remarkably complex area to deal with. But at the same time, almost every client I speak to tells me that, that they're getting this huge pressure from their business leaders to say, we have to implement AI. We have to do it like yesterday. We're behind our competitors. We don't have time to stop and think about this. We just need to do it. And so you've got this, as I say, this perfect storm of a huge complexity, huge amounts of regulation, but then a drive to do everything yesterday. And I think how we land on a coherent set of regulation that is actually something that people can work with and implement in practice, that doesn't create massive divergence across borders, but at the same time addresses some of the very significant risks that certain types of AI can introduce. I mean, that I think is going to be the challenge for the next 10, 20 years.
In the time that you've specialised, almost 2 decades in privacy and data protection, is this probably, in the last sort of 12 months, with obviously everyone's talking about AI, is this probably been the the most complex area, and where you've gone, blimey, okay, how's this going to pan out?
Yeah, I mean, I think over the course of my career, I've probably seen a number of sort of peaks and troughs in terms of, work. Cookie consent was a big thing. Data transfers is the gift that keeps on giving. CCPA, standard contractual clauses. Obviously, the GDPR implementation was a hugely busy period for everybody. I don't think I've seen, even with all of those things, I don't think I've seen anything that has exploded onto the scene quite in the way that AI, and particularly generative AI, has. I mean, it's always been a bit of my practice for a number of years. There are always clients coming forward saying, we're doing this bit of machine learning or that bit of machine learning. But it felt like it's sort of, over the past year, it's just caught everybody's imagination. I think OpenAI and ChatGPT are really, we can attribute it to the awakening that ChatGPT brought. I mean, I think for most people, when he talked about AI machine learning, it was something that was slightly ethereal and hard for them to get grasp hold of or to understand. And then ChatGPT emerged and was suddenly writing songs and poems and stories and emails and what have you. And suddenly everybody got it. And I think they were also just amazed at the quality with which it could do it. I mean, I know everybody likes to get a bit sort of snobbish about, oh, it's got all these hallucinations and what have you. But the reality, particularly with the later versions, is that it does it extremely well, much more in a much more advanced way than I think many of us realized was possible. And with that, suddenly there's been an explosion of business interest. And so yes, on a professional level, I don't think I've ever seen anything that has grabbed as much attention as this has.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, we're almost done, Phil. But so, as I always ask at the end of each episode, just for a bit of fun, who would be your two ultimate dinner guests?
Oh, this is such a difficult question to ask, because I was thinking about this, and I'm not somebody who's that starstruck by other people. I guess the people I tend to draw inspiration from are often the people that are closest to me. So it is my parents and the things that they've been through. It's my wife and my kids. It's the little everyday things that inspire me more so than the big the big celebrities or politicians. But if given that I can't bring my entire family to the dinner, I would probably have to settle on two people. Stephen Fry, mainly because he's just this remarkably erudite individual who I love reading his books. I love listening to him on the radio. He just has this kind of depth and breadth of knowledge about absolutely everything that, and a way of presenting it in a very light touch way that I always feel whenever I listen to him that I come away a more educated person than I was before. So he, and also I think he'd be bloody good entertainment as well. So I think that would, secondly, Malala Yousaf, I think, would be my second pick. I think she's just hugely inspirational in terms of being somebody who is very young, who's gone through just experiences that I can't imagine, lived a life that is more in a 20-odd years than I have in my 40-odd, but also has kind of, without asking to be, become a sort of a leader on the world stage, but does so again in a very sort of understated way, and just seems like a normal person thrust into the limelight and handling things in a very just an incredible intelligent way, that promoting human rights, promoting girls' education. I think she probably is if I had to pick a hero, she would be my hero. So I think the two of them would make for a great dinner.
Absolutely, can't disagree.
You're
with
invited,
that,
by the
Phil.
way, Anthony.
Oh, thank you. I'd love to come along. Actually, just struck me when you're talking about Stephen Fry. I was thinking perhaps that's what, if you have the identikit of a very good lawyer, a lot of the attributes he's got, depth of knowledge, but able to communicate it succinctly and understandably for the normal person on the street. Perhaps is attributed to many lawyers, much like yourself. So, Phil, listen, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our session. I'm sure our listeners will as well. And we all wish you the absolute best with Digiphile, and we all look forward to watching it go from strength to strength. To everyone who's listened, thank you so much. I'll be back very soon, I hope, with somebody else to talk about their journeys through privacy. But for now, Phil, thanks again, and have a good day.
Thank you very much for having me.